Today is August 20th, 2024, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When prospective families, contact us about studies, and even adult students, when we're initially contacted as they browse our website or look to see what courses we have available, they often ask me if we provide videos or lectures or tutorials, and they ask questions about how the lessons are presented, how the material is taught, and so on. And it's very difficult for me to communicate to them that I don't believe that any of that is necessary. It seems that most prospective students or parents who are looking for a study program expect there to be some sort of entertainment or program that they participate in somewhat passively, and that this is the role of a school or this is the role of a teacher. And they want to know, what exactly is the program going to be like? What does the show consist of? How does it work? Videos, lectures. And I say, no, none of that. That's not how our program works. And I'd like to explain why I think that videos and lectures and lessons from a teacher, from a living teacher, are really not necessary. And to not simply be critical or negative in responding, I'd like to also explain positively what I think is more effective and why. It's always been interesting to me to read the Gospels and read where Jesus says, "Call no man teacher, for you have only one teacher, and that is the Christ." Call no man teacher. It's a very interesting command. And when we read it, we have to ask ourselves what the meaning could be, because literally, obviously, we call men teachers. We say, this is my faith formation teacher, this is my second grade teacher, and so on. But when Jesus says, call no man teacher, the idea there is that there's no man who can actually fulfill the true and proper role of a teacher. Only Christ can be the teacher, the capital T, teacher. And he explains why. He explains that no one has ever seen God, and therefore no one can explain him. No one can teach the truth about God. No one knows God. The only one who knows God is he who dwelt in the bosom of the Father who came down from heaven. He alone can explain him, can teach him. There is only one teacher, and that's the Christ. And this is why in Scripture we find Jesus referred to as the wisdom of God. He is the teacher. He is the master. He is the ultimate rabbi in sacred Scripture. No one can teach except for the one who came down from heaven. And so he says to us, call no man teacher, for you have only one teacher, and that is the Christ. Now we can understand the context of that statement, and that it refers to theology, the knowledge and study of God himself. There is no one who can teach us theology, no one but the Son of God himself. He is the teacher of theology. But if we go into other areas, we might find some who are qualified to be called a teacher, even in a secondary sense. After all, every subject is itself subject to the truth of theology. Theology is the master or the mistress of all the sciences. And we read in the book of Psalms, which became the motto of Oxford University Press, a beautiful line that says, "In thy light we see light." In other words, nothing can be understood truly unless it's understood in light of true theology. So Christ is ultimately the only teacher, the only one who even claims with any credibility to be the teacher. He explains the only one who could teach about God is one who was with God and who came from God. And he's the one who not only claims that, but gives evidence that he is such. So as a Christian, and I know that some non-Christians may be listening, but you can see the reasoning in Christianity why Christ would be recognized as the only man qualified to be the teacher of theology. All the rest of us, even the so-called doctors of the church in the Catholic faith, they're not teachers in the same sense that Christ is a teacher. They're called teachers because they help to explain the things that Christ himself revealed to us about God. So we have this idea presented to us by Christ about what it really means to be a teacher. And we can see that very few of us, very few human beings, really qualify in any sense to be called teacher. When we are called teacher, it's relative. I may be called teacher by a child who knows nothing of a certain subject, and I'm called teacher because the child looks to me as the source of that learning. But that can be deceiving and untrue, because very rarely is the person called teacher the actual source of the information. So you see, we've got this interesting little dilemma here. And I know some might say, oh, this is silly. You're just making something of nothing. But I don't think that's true. I think it's actually very significant. I think that the way that information is delivered to students has an effect on how students think of that information, how they think of information in the future that they'd like to pursue, how they think about pursuing it, and so on. I think we actually impart to our students, to children, incorrect ways of thinking about learning, incorrect ways of thinking about the actual process of studying and truth-seeking and so on. We teach them that they're dependent on us, that we are the mediators between the students and the learning, when this is not true. Now, when we think about what students need access to the truth. They need access to good teaching. They need access to systematic, orderly instruction. And if we were to go back through history and say, well, where should this instruction come from? It should come from history's greatest teachers. If you have the option to choose to have your son taught theology by Thomas Aquinas or by Joe Schmo, a professor at a local college or seminary, I think most of us would choose Thomas Aquinas if that was truly an option. If we could choose a teacher for philosophy, I think most of us would choose Aristotle rather than a modern college professor. These men, these great historical, intellectual masters, were, in some sense, like Christ. Aristotle, for example, was the discoverer of the art of reasoning. As the discoverer of that art, he was most fit to teach it, to explain it. And at that moment in history, he was the only person who could explain it. He was, in that sense, truly a teacher. He was teaching something that he himself discovered. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albert the Great in the 12th and 13th centuries, they were the ones who first explained, really first established the harmony between Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic theology. And being the ones who did the work to synthesize the two, to bring them into harmony and explain how they agree, they were, in a proper sense, the teachers of scholastic theology. They were not the sources of theology itself. They were the sources of a species of theological instruction, of theological understanding. And as the developers of that system of theological science, they were, properly speaking, its teachers. And so it would make sense to sit and listen to lectures from St. Thomas Aquinas, because the content that he was sharing was unique to his understanding. It was, in a sense, new and had to be learned from him. But once his teaching was finished, once his lectures were written down and made available in print, there was no need for anyone to do the work that St. Thomas had done. It could be read, it could be studied. And so if I was asked to teach scholastic theology, I would not stand in front of the class, pretend that I was Thomas Aquinas, and give lectures as if the understanding of this science comes from me. I would simply read the lectures of St. Thomas Aquinas. And what's interesting is that the word lecture means reading. I would stand before the students and read the lessons of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is our teacher. I would read the writings of Aristotle, who is our teacher in the art of logic and in the philosophical sciences that he himself established. I would read the Gospels, read the teachings of our Lord, read the message of the apostles, who, by the way, make it very clear that they're not the source of their instruction, but that they are simply messengers, ambassadors for Christ. And you see that that's the proper disposition that a good teacher should have. Unless you're actually the source of the learning, you should not present yourself as a teacher of that learning. You should present yourself as a reader or a messenger of the true teacher. And so, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I don't believe, considering the subjects we study, considering the sources available to us, I don't believe that it's necessary or even good to have lectures that have living teachers stand before students and speak to them, making decisions about what should be said, in what order it should be said, what should be omitted, how it should be said, and so on. I don't believe that any of us qualify for such a role, especially when the teaching of the true masters, the true historical masters, is available to us and to our students. And so for me, I desire for my students to learn the truth of the subjects of our curriculum directly from the masters. And therefore, I direct my students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy to read and read and read. And so when one comes to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and they say, well, how does this work? How do we study these subjects? I say, we have already chosen the most authoritative and excellent texts to be studied. We have made all of them available to students, and therefore, Lesson 1 begins with reading the first chapter of the appropriate book. And what we do for the lesson is we provide a set of questions or assignments for the students to complete, to use as a guide for their study. And the instructions in the assignment say something like, these questions are intended to help you develop and demonstrate your understanding of the lesson. I see my goal, my responsibility, not really as being a teacher, even though we use that term loosely and I end up being called a teacher or a master or a headmaster. In the proper sense of the term, I'm no such thing. I'm a fellow student. The teachers are the authors of the textbooks, especially in our program. The teachers are men like Aristotle, Euclid, Cicero, Thomas Aquinas, the prophets and apostles, and so on. They're our teachers. They are the sources of our instruction. And the test of our learning is whether we gain understanding and even mastery of what they have taught. Gain mastery of their works. And so for me, when I look at my students, what I consider successful learning is if my students are asked a question, they turn to the texts for the answers. They turn to the masters for the answers. That's the true test of classical Catholic learning. Now, I know that this is very unpopular today, but I don't care because, again, I'm concerned with classical Catholic education. So if someone asks a question about a topic in theology, I want to see a student hear the question, stop, think about where that answer might be found in an authoritative source. Go search that source for the answer and then return with the answer from that source. And for Catholics, that source could be the Catechism of the Catholic Church. For Christians in general, it could be a passage or multiple passages from sacred scripture. That's a sign of true learning in a classical Catholic context. If there's a philosophical question, and I see a student go and find an answer in the writings of Thomas Aquinas or in the writings of Aristotle or another one of the master philosophers, I consider that the demonstration of understanding, not just of the topic, but of learning itself. The student recognizes, respects, and refers to the masters. That requires humility, that requires diligence, and that's true learning. That's true learning. Now, that's not popular in modern democratic society where everyone is told that their opinions are all equally valuable. We've confused the idea of being equal with respect to having a vote with actually having opinions that are of equal value. Democracy running out of control has led us to think and act like that. My opinions are irrelevant on most subjects when we have the judgments and explanations and demonstrations of history's wisest and best men, even the Son of God himself, available to us to consult. We're warned in Scripture against being wise in our own eyes. And yet the way that modern people answer questions, the way that modern teachers lead their students, and so on, is to be wise in our own eyes. We're taught in the Proverbs to not lean on our own understanding, but to trust in the Lord. In other words, to always defer to divine revelation, to defer to authority. That's considered wisdom, and that's a test of true learning, to see that someone does that. And so in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, this is what I'm looking to foster in my students, and this is what I'm looking for as they study and develop. I'm looking to see that they understand, respect, refer to authority, that they go to the masters, that they go to the most authoritative sources for their answers. And so to answer the question, how do these courses work? What do we do? As I said before, we read them. We read the master texts. Now some will say, isn't that really difficult? Isn't it really difficult to read the master texts? And we see this in all subjects. For example, I spoke the other day on learning to read real Latin and Greek. And I emphasized the word real, how to learn to read real Latin and Greek. And when I posted the video, there were comments and objections and criticisms from people saying it's too hard for students to begin reading real Latin. And therefore they say we should start with some artificial Latin like lingua latina, which can be used as sort of a ramp that leads us from fake, overly simplified Latin that's made up by the author of the book, who is not a Latin master. And for all the people who say, oh yes, this is great, he's a real none of us are the judge of mastery of Latin. The masters themselves, men like Cicero, they're the masters of the Latin language. And so to say, well, we can have some artificial Latin that works like a ramp that gets us started, and then maybe after a year or two of that artificial Latin, then we can start to read real Latin. And my argument is, you've just wasted 2 years and made an excuse for not beginning with real Latin. So if you say, oh, well, isn't that going to take time? Isn't that going to be difficult? Isn't taking 2 years to read fake Latin also going to take a lot of time? And we still haven't proven that we can read the real Latin yet. Rather, let's start with real Latin. Let's begin reading St. Jerome's Let's begin reading St. Jerome's translation of the Gospel of John into Latin. And of course there's a method to do that, and we follow that method in our Latin reading courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and any student in that course will agree that it's not difficult. It's not difficult. And it's been done that way for thousands of years. It's not difficult. And the same is true of other subjects. The same is true of philosophy. If I were to say, how will we begin the study of philosophy? Are we going to have lectures? Are we going to have classes where I introduce the concepts of philosophy and provide my own lessons, give my own lectures and so on. No, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to read the Masters. We're going to start reading the Masters. Now, for younger students, there are ways to do this other than just jumping into Aristotle. For example, in the Academy, for moral philosophy, we begin by studying Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables are easy for the children to read and understand, or so they think. And we ask simple questions. We ask students to paraphrase the fable, to explain the fable or restate the fable in their own words. We then ask the students to identify one moral lesson that's taught in the fable. Understanding this to be moral philosophy, we ask the students to identify one moral lesson in the fable. Normally, students can see the main moral lesson that Aesop was attempting to teach, but sometimes they come up with other ideas. And I encourage them to do so. I say, why don't you think about the fable from the perspective of one of the other characters? What moral lesson is learned if we look at the story through the eyes of one of the other characters? And that presents a new challenge. But we read the Masters. We learn Aesop's fables. We learn to identify moral lessons in the fables. Now, when young children are doing this work, 10, 11, 12 years old, they're going to have immature answers for some of these questions, and that's okay. Because I explained to them, you can study these fables and draw lessons from them for the rest of your life. Aesop was a wise man. His writings are filled with wisdom. And that wisdom can continue to be uncovered as you grow and gain more and more experience, gain more learning, become more mature and wiser. You'll see in the fables more and more that can be drawn out. But for now, the students' immature, inexperienced answers are good, and many of them would probably surprise you. But then we move on to more challenging questions. We ask, in light of that moral lesson that you've identified, why do you think Aesop chose to tell the story using the characters that he did? Why do you think he chose to use a wolf and a lamb? Why do you think he chose to use 2 frogs or a camel? And so we challenge the students to try to think about the master, Aesop, who wrote the fable, and why he might have done what he did. And we make sure that we don't allow the kids to get lost in the fables, but to think about the author himself. And then lastly, the final question we ask students in our Aesop's Fables courses, we ask them to think of how that moral fable, with its general moral lesson, might apply specifically to their lives. How might they use that fable or that moral lesson in their own unique circumstances? And for the children, that last question is the most difficult. Thinking of the application is the most difficult, but that is the real challenge of true moral philosophy. Aristotle says our goal is not to simply learn about the moral lesson, but to become better men. And so it's that work of application, asking, so what? How does this apply to my life? What direction does this lesson give me in my own life, in my real circumstances? That's the challenging question that students are asked last. But all of their study comes directly from the text of Aesop. There's no lecture. There's no necessary explanation. In fact, I remove. There have been times where I have had classes with students and we've discussed the fables, and I've recorded those discussions, and I used to share those discussions, but I've come to second guess that and remove them because I want the students not to think about what I said about the fable or what other students said about the fable. I want the students to read Aesop's words and learn from Aesop himself directly. And so we begin moral philosophy with the study of Aesop's fables. We also study a work by Aristotle's successor, Theophrastus, a work called The Characters, which is another study in moral philosophy, which introduces students, younger students, introduces them to the virtues and vices. And so we learn about a character, we learn about his habits, the habits that reveal his character. We learn about the predominant vice of different individual characters. We learn about the vice by example. And we ask questions like, how have you practiced this vice in your own life? Why should you look out for someone who can be identified by these habits, and so on? And having studied Aesop's fables and Theophrastus's characters, when we come to the study of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the kids really have little difficulty getting started in that authoritative philosophical text. Now, as I explained in a talk yesterday on how to study true philosophy, the opening chapters of the Nicomachean Ethics are difficult, but we acknowledge that difficulty. So, for example, in the very opening chapter of the Ethics, Aristotle says that there are two kinds of ends in human actions. Two kinds of ends. Some are works, and some he calls energies. In the English translation, the word is energies, which is a good translation. Now, just about every student who comes to that passage immediately wants to ask, what are energies? What does that mean? I don't get it. I don't understand this sentence, and so on. And they expect me to explain for them what energies and works are. And I won't do it, because it's not necessary. And they have to learn how to study, and they have to learn how to access the master texts themselves. So I teach them what to do in that situation. I say, if you come across a concept or a word that you don't understand, make a note of it. Look over the context and ask yourself, what might this word mean in this context? And then simply reason about the terms and try to determine what can be determined based on what's there in the text. So, for example, if I said, well, let's think about what an energy is. What can you tell me positively about an energy? What can you tell me positively? You can say, well, it's a kind of end. It's a kind of end, and that's very good. An energy, in this context, as Aristotle uses the term, an energy is one kind of end. What else can you tell me? You can say, well, it's not a work. And that's another great answer. An energy is a kind of end of human actions, but it's not a work. It's not something that's produced by a man. It's not something that's external to a man, because the idea of a work is usually pretty clear to the students because Aristotle explains it a bit more, but energy is often puzzling. But we can come quite close to the meaning of the word energies. Energies are ends that are not works. And that would be a good working understanding of energies at that point in our studies. And so what I tell the students is work to understand as well as you can what the text says. And then as we move forward in the reading, keep those difficult points in mind and continue asking yourself, is there anything in this lesson that helps me understand what I read in that lesson? And constantly keep those uncertain things in mind, looking for help. As I said, let Aristotle interpret Aristotle. And so the students learn how to actually study, to study patiently, to make notes. They understand what the purpose of notes are. Notes are not simply to make a copy of what's being studied. Notes are our own personal summary and reflection on what's being studied. We write questions to ourselves in our notes. We write definitions of terms in our notes. We make outlines in our notes, and so on. They learn the purpose of taking notes as a record of our studies. So the students are learning how to study. They don't have to get the right answer immediately without any effort. They don't have to have someone go before them and remove every difficulty. It's actually good for them to learn to wrestle with those difficulties, just as for us in the Christian life, it's good for us to undergo trials. Trials teach us how to live. And the difficulties of study are the trials of learning. They're good for us. What the students need is a guide who can help them, who can clear things up when there is some need for clearing up. And I'll give you an example of a need for clearing up. Excuse me if this takes a little bit of time to explain. It's a complicated problem. In Aristotle's Categories, in the very first chapter of the Categories, Aristotle is introducing the concept of homonymous terms. And this language is unfamiliar to the students, so they're ready to quit. Anytime something is unfamiliar, students are looking for an excuse to quit. Oh, this is too hard. Oh, the translation's no good. Oh, this book stinks. Oh, I don't like this course. Oh, I'm not good at this. That's all normal human nature. But they're being introduced to unfamiliar terms in a subject that they've never studied before, the most important of all subjects in learning, the art of reasoning. And Aristotle explains that there are homonymous terms or ideas, I should say, that are identified in speech with the same word, but the ideas are different. So the same word is used to name two different ideas. The same word is used to name two different ideas. And we're not talking about classes of things. We're not talking about an apple and an orange being called a fruit. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a word that's used to name two heterogeneous things, two things that are not related. And I'll give you an example. Aristotle explains that when we look at an ox and we ask, what is it? We answer the question, it's an animal. We identify the genus of the ox. We say, that's an animal. And in Greek, the word for animal is zoon, where we get the word zoology from. Zoon. And then Aristotle says something else that's confusing. He says, we do the same thing when we look at an image. And students read that and they say, what does that mean? We use the same word when we name an ox and when we name an image. We use the word animal, and realize that they're reading the English translation, so they don't see the Greek word zoon. They see animal. an ox is an animal, and then a picture is an image. And the students will say, oh, I think I get it. I think I get it. What he's saying is, if you see an ox in a field, a living ox, you'll point to it and say, that's an animal. And then if you see a picture of an ox, you'll say, oh, what's this? Oh, it's an animal. But really, it's just a picture of an animal. And so the students, based on the English translation, think that they get what Aristotle's explaining there, but they're actually wrong. It's a very difficult passage to get around. Impossible, I would say, in English. Now, this is where a guide can be helpful to say, hold on. You've done well, students, in reading the text and doing your best to understand what's being said. But there's a problem here that you can't be responsible for. There's a problem here that you can't be expected to overcome, because the problem is in the translation. The problem requires us to go back and look at the Greek text. And only an experienced tutor can provide this kind of help. And the problem is that the Greek word for animal is zoon. And the Greek word for a picture is also zoon. So he's not saying that there's an animal in the picture and that zoon refers to the animal, because in that sense, zoon would actually have the same meaning. That's not what he's saying. He's not making a distinction between a living animal and a picture of an animal. He's actually saying that the Greek word zoon is the name used to refer to an animal, and the Greek word zoon is also the name used to refer to a picture. And if you get a Greek dictionary and look up the word zoon, you'll see that the first definition is an animal. And if you go down to the other definitions, you'll find that the second or third definition is a picture or an image or a sign of something. So what Aristotle is actually explaining is that the word zoon in those examples is used homonymously. And I know that's a complicated example, but that's the kind of thing that students do need help with. But it's good for them to read through the text and encounter those problems for themselves and to think what the answer might be, and have a guide say, no, that's actually not. That's a good attempt, but that's actually not the problem here. The problem here is in translation, and I can explain that. Now, some might say, well, yeah, but if you gave a lecture rather than have the kids read the book, if you gave a lecture, couldn't you have eliminated that difficulty? Couldn't you have avoided that trouble and saved time, and so on? And the answer is yes. Yes, if I gave a lecture to the students and explained the concepts myself, I could eliminate that trouble in that specific instance, which was a problem with a translation, or a problem caused by a translation. But that's not the problem with lectures. Let's say that in a chapter there are 12 different points of information to be learned, and I'm just making that number up. Let's say there are 12 important points to be learned. Let's say there's a couple new concepts, some new vocabulary words, a rule, 12 things to be learned in the lesson. What a modern teacher would normally do is prepare a lecture and present those 12 things. And the students wouldn't read the text, wouldn't need to read the text, would need to just repeat what the teacher said on the test or in the homework questions or whatever. The need to work with the text and the more important lesson of looking to the masters is not being taught in that class. Students are not developing that habit of going to the sources. Now, of those 12 topics, if the students were allowed to read the text for themselves, they might come up with 9 of the 12 topics. They might accurately understand all of them but one. There might be one sentence in the reading that they have a difficult time with. That long, boring lecture, which makes students passive and takes them away from the text, would spend most of its time talking about things and explaining things that none of the students would have any trouble learning directly from the text. And the 1 or 2 problems that the students would have in the text, the 1 or 2 problems that they would have, would appear in their answers to the assigned questions. More importantly, the troubles that the students have might not be the same. One student might struggle to understand point number 6 and perfectly understand points number 7 and 8, while another student had an easy time with point 6 and with 7 but struggled with 8. Why would the entire class need to be subjected to a long, boring lecture explaining all 12 points when they could have learned 9, 10, 11, maybe even all of them on their own by reading the text for themselves and learning to study, learning to take responsibility for their own learning, learning to study accurately, to study what I say carefully and completely? That's more important than trying to save time or get everything right as easily as possible, because we're not giving the children the most important lesson, which is confidence in accessing the authoritative text directly themselves. So what I prefer to do is provide a brief introduction to say something like, in this lesson we're going to read Aristotle's discussion of this subject. And then I give the students an assignment, a set of comprehension questions, a set of instructions to follow. And as I said before, these questions they're not just information retrieval questions. Those are the kinds of questions that allow for cheating. So if you ask a question like, what does Aristotle teach about the kinds of ends? A student can take that question and go type it into ChatGPT and get an answer. It's not the kind of question that students should be asked. So I give students questions that are intended to guide their study, and again, as the instructions say, to help them to develop and demonstrate their understanding. Many of the questions I ask them are open-ended. I ask them to summarize the chapter. I ask them to identify the main idea of the lesson. I ask them to describe something that they found new or interesting in the lesson. I ask them to consider what they're reading in light of recent readings that we've completed in the course, and so on. The questions are questions that help them to develop and demonstrate their ability to study the texts accurately for themselves. They're not the kind of questions you can cheat on, and so the problem of cheating goes away. And then the students submit all of their answers to me, and I review all of their written work. And I can see that Thomas answers the questions very well, but doesn't write with complete sentences, so I can address a grammar problem in his work, while also addressing his study of Aristotle's moral philosophy. And I can see that he has a good grasp of the lesson, not perfect, but a good grasp, so I can give him a passing grade and say, there's room for improvement in this lesson. If you'd like a perfect score, you need to go back, review the lesson, and resubmit the assignment, and let's see if you can earn a perfect score. And by the way, clean up your grammar and rewrite these sentences so that they're complete and that they follow our grammar studies. And I then turn to the assignment of another student and read it and see that he struggled with a certain point in the lesson, a certain question, and I can address his need for help with that one specific lesson, mark it wrong, decide whether there's something that appears to be causing him to stumble or whether he's simply not studying carefully and completely, and send him back to his lesson to study more carefully, improve his answers, and resubmit them. And I allow the students to resubmit their work as many times as it takes until they earn a perfect score. And then I'll go on to another student and he'll have other issues. Another student will have a perfect paper. Another student will have other issues. And lesson after lesson, chapter after chapter, across different subjects, I get to know the individual students. I know their strengths and their weaknesses. I know what help they need. I know what help they don't need. And I don't need to give a single lecture. They don't need me to baby feed them. They don't need me to act like mommy in the classroom and read the book for them or tell them what it means. They learn that they can go and read and study and get the answers themselves and communicate those answers in their own words. And they gain confidence studying the authoritative texts themselves. Now, is that a slow process? Sure it is in the beginning, but all good things are slow in the beginning. Think about piano lessons. When a student learns a new song on a musical instrument, whether it's piano or anything else, what the student is told is to practice the piece with perfect accuracy. Go nice and slow and learn to play the piece accurately. Don't worry about speed, worry about accuracy. And so the student begins, and he begins studying a new piece to be played, and he begins working through it, studying the part, practicing, coming across his mistakes, slowing down, working through difficult parts more carefully, until he can play through the whole piece slowly but accurately. And then he does it again and again and again. And each time his muscle memory begins to take over and his playing gets easier and faster and easier and faster until he can play the piece at full speed. What's true for the study of music is true for any subject. Our first concern should be accuracy, and we should only talk about speed after we've established accuracy. And in fact, if we focus on accuracy, speed will come naturally. Every important text begins with the principles of the science or the art and builds on them in future lessons. Therefore, to try to rush students through the initial lessons, through the principles, so they can feel like they're making progress just because they're moving into new lessons, is only going to make the future lessons more difficult to understand. Whereas if we take our time and respect the fact that the foundation is being laid in the early lessons, and we should give them more time, we'll actually understand the principles, the elements of the art or the science, and by understanding them clearly, rather than trying to rush through them, we'll have a solid foundation for the continued study of the subject. Just like building a house. I remember when our house was built, so much time was spent clearing the land, digging the foundation, pouring the concrete, adjusting all different aspects of the foundation and the footings and all this. It seemed like weeks and weeks and weeks to get the foundation finished. And then the rest of the house flew together. And we just see that example, that principle, that the beginning is half of the whole. That was an old saying. The beginning is half of the whole. What's true in instrumental music lessons, what's true in construction, is also true in real learning. The foundation should be slow and careful and complete, and if we do that work carefully, the rest will come relatively quickly and easily. If we try to fake it and rush through and brag about how many lessons we've finished when we really haven't finished any of them, we're only seeking appearances, and that's not true learning. So I have the students work slowly, and I make sure they have a firm foundation. I make them study. I make them answer the questions. I make them go back to the text and improve their answers. They can resubmit assignments until I finally read the assignment that they submit and say, well done, you got it. This is great. You've got everything. Let's move on to the next lesson. And I give them a 100% score, mark that lesson complete, and we move on. That's how I conduct studies in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy in every single subject. Every subject. Whether it's classical Latin, whether it's English grammar, whether it's moral philosophy, classical arithmetic, classical geometry, modern mathematics, modern natural science, literature, foreign language, history, no matter what the subject is, we pursue our studies in the same way, seeking mastery directly from the texts, learning how to study, learning how to access the text directly, learning skills like understanding vocabulary and context, identifying main ideas, learning how to distill the ideas and intentions of an author from what's written by an understanding of how language works. Students learn those things lesson by lesson over time, and they all know that the only way to move forward is to actually develop and demonstrate understanding. There's no way around it. You're going to have to submit that assignment to Mr. Michael, and he's not going to let it pass until you've demonstrated your understanding. And that's another key part of the assignment. They have to demonstrate their understanding. They have to prove that they have studied the lesson. You can't just answer a question. You can't pull an answer off Google or ChatGPT, because while you might have the right answer, you haven't proven that you studied the lesson. You haven't proven that you studied the text from Cicero or the Gospel of John text from St. Jerome or the text from Aristotle. All you've shown is that you managed to find the answer somewhere. That's not the assignment. The assignment is to answer the question and prove that the author is the source of that answer. And students who want to cheat can't do that. And students who can do that will never cheat. So there's much more to this work of instruction than just getting kids to the test, telling them the answers so they can enter the answers on the test and get passing grades, and everybody can move on and keep moving and keep moving and keep moving without ever learning anything. St. Paul complained about those who are always learning, yet never come to the knowledge of the truth, because they never actually study. They're not interested in real learning. They're interested in appearances of learning. They're interested in pretending they're learning. They're interested in accidental things that relate to education, such as diplomas or certificates, degrees, and so on, rather than the actual treasure, which is the knowledge of the subjects itself. And so this is why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you're not going to find video lessons. You're not going to find lectures. You're going to begin every lesson by reading. You're going to learn to study. You're going to learn to develop and demonstrate your understanding through written answers. You're going to learn to submit those answers for review, knowing that if you don't prove that you've studied carefully, it's going to be given back to you, and you're going to be sent back to the text. And that's how every lesson's going to go from the beginning of your studies until the end. And students actually learn how to study. They learn that if they want to know something, what they need is an authoritative source. They don't need to go to Google. They don't need to use ChatGPT. They don't need to find some person. They don't need to pay some expensive tuition to gain access to information. They just need to know what the authoritative source is for that subject of learning, so that they can go and get the information that they need from a credible, proven, authoritative, I should say, source. That's real learning. And that's what we're seeking to do in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So this is why, again, as a teacher, I think the most important work that a teacher does, and again, speaking in a certain sense, the most important thing that I can do for my students is prepare for them the best sources for study, and I've done that. Prepare for them the best sources of study, and then guide their studies, and then evaluate their studies by reviewing their work, and then determining when they're ready to move on in their studies. That's really the work, I believe, of a great tutor, of a great guide for the kind of study that we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which is classical Catholic studies. We're not just trying to get a high school diploma. We're not just trying to get admitted to college. Those things are easy. Kids do that in the worst public schools in America. We're trying to gain understanding of the most important subjects from the wisest and most authoritative sources. That's our goal in studying in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, to actually gain wisdom and to learn how to learn for life. And there's no other way to do that. So if you're interested in studying, you better like to read, because we read in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Now some will say, oh, but I have a different learning style. Oh, I need videos. Oh, I need this and that. I need a living teacher. You're not going to be able to afford to learn if that's true. And if it's true that you can't learn unless some big expensive circus is constructed, then you're not going to learn. Or you're going to be restricted to such a small number of subjects, which is what happens in modern schools. Because we get into all of this learning methods, styles, and we need all of these different resources and videos and living teachers and therapists and specialists and assistants and all of this equipment and all of these manipulatives and supplies and on and on and on. We need to go on field trips and actually visit places. We can't learn about them from a text. All that does is limit what you're going to be able to study. And you are not going to be able to afford to have a broad and deep education if every single lesson you learn costs $10,000. In order to be wise, to have breadth of learning and depth of learning, students must learn to access knowledge from texts. We have the writings of history's wisest and best men. We don't have videos of their instruction. They didn't leave behind drawings. They didn't leave behind manipulatives and projects for us to do. We can't go on field trips with them and explore things. And the way that God made our minds to work, that's not even necessary. We've been given reason, which allows us to learn things that we've never seen, that we've never touched or smelled or tasted. That's one of the great benefits of the faculty of reasoning. The same is true of the gift of faith. We can understand things that we've never known, we've never experienced. So there's a lot to this, and I'd like it to not be overly simplified. I'd like it to not be thought that we're just not providing something. It's very strategic. And when people object or when people complain, I ask them, if you want a lecture from me, if you want videos and resources from me, let me ask you this. Who taught me? What videos did I watch? What lectures did I listen to? I learned by studying. And I help students to learn by studying. I'm the director of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, leading the work of researching, restoring, publishing, and teaching the Classical Liberal Arts curriculum. And I've done so by studying texts. I've not been taught on videos. I've not been taught through lectures. I've not sat and passively listened as someone else gave me all the answers. I started from scratch. My wife can tell you. I started by collecting books from the library at Rutgers University and just reading and reading and reading, starting to notice certain things that were in the books that the people that I heard teaching and talking had wrong. And I continued to rely on the text, continued reading and reading and reading, and I avoided the errors that many modern people have made. And I've restored the true classical Catholic curriculum. And you have the privilege of being able to study it with access to all the texts that are necessary, because I've collected them through my own studies and research through the years, and they're all available now in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So when there is an objection about why isn't there a video, or why don't I make this, or why don't I make that, all I ask is because I've never had those resources, and they're not necessary. If you think that I'm worthy to teach these subjects, then let me teach you this. You can get this learning from texts for almost no cost, and I'm not going to build a circus when we can learn these things very simply, because what we need to do is we need to make learning affordable, because we have a lot to learn and we don't have money to waste. Now, I could say a lot more about that, and I think that as you see the Classical Liberal Arts College program develop, you're going to see where all of this is headed and how it's going to radically solve problems that plague modern Christian young men and women, even influence the vocations crisis. These are important issues. Ideas have consequences, and these ideas have very important consequences. I ask you to trust me that everything that needs to be learned in classical Catholic studies can be learned from simple, freely available texts. And that's something we should be very thankful for. So I hope that helps to explain why you're not going to find some big library of videos and all kinds of multimedia content and all of this stuff that everyone's eager to publish and produce. Other than these talks that I post, you're not going to find much, because I want my students to study the true teachers, to read the teachings of the masters and know them completely and directly, because that will be the surest foundation for their knowledge as adults, but also for their confidence in their knowledge as adults. And it also teaches them how to study anything that they'll ever need to study for the rest of their lives. And I think that's the responsibility of a true teacher, of a good guide for students. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions about anything that I discussed or would like to get into anything more thoroughly, feel free to write to me. My email address is wcm@classicalliberalarts.com. I'm happy to discuss these things, but I do hope that's helpful and encouraging, and hope that you can rest assured knowing that we're not simply avoiding producing content, we're intentionally not producing these training wheels of multimedia content and preliminary lectures and talks and all this stuff, which just keeps students from the real work of studying the masters. God bless.